what would happen if Russia lost the war against Ukraine? It's a question with global consequences, and the answers reach far beyond the battlefields of Bakhmut and Kherson. A Russian defeat wouldn't just end a war, it could reshape the future of Europe, collapse an entire security structure, shift global alliances, and trigger political upheaval inside the Kremlin. But to truly understand what a Russian loss would mean, we have to separate emotion from analysis and dig into the complex web of military realities, economic pressure, political calculations, and historical precedent. Welcome to the channel, where we go beyond the headlines and into the heart of global events. If you're new here and want sharp, fact-based updates on today's most pressing issues, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Let's begin by setting the stage. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, expecting a swift victory. What it got instead was a war of attrition. More than 2 years later, the conflict grinds on with no decisive winner. Yet, Ukraine, backed by billions of dollars in Western military aid, has managed to resist and, at times, push back against the Russian advance. Russia, for its part, still occupies roughly 18% of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which it annexed in 2014, and parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. But what would it mean for Russia to actually lose? Let's define that. A loss could take several forms: a complete military withdrawal from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, a collapse of Russian military effectiveness, a negotiated peace that leaves Ukraine fully intact and aligned with the West, or even a breakdown of political support inside Russia leading to regime change. Each of these scenarios carries profound consequences for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the rest of the world. First, the military implications. If Russian forces are forced to retreat completely, it would be a historic humiliation for the Kremlin. Russia has long seen Ukraine not just as a neighbor, but as part of its sphere of influence, an extension of Russian identity. Losing this war would shatter that narrative and seriously damage the image of Russian military might, which has been carefully cultivated since the Soviet era. Western intelligence suggests that Russia has already lost hundreds of thousands of troops, both killed and wounded. Their stockpiles of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition have been severely depleted. A total loss would expose the vulnerability of what was once seen as one of the world's most powerful militaries. It would also change global calculations. Nations once hesitant to defy Russia militarily or diplomatically might now feel emboldened. Second, the political consequences inside Russia. President Vladimir Putin has staked his reputation, and likely his legacy, on this war. He has framed it as a necessary special military operation to protect Russia's security and fight what he calls Nazi influence in Ukraine. That narrative has been used to justify the invasion to the Russian public, which has been largely shielded from the full reality of the conflict by state-controlled media. But what happens if the war ends in failure? A Russian loss could trigger internal dissent on a scale not seen in decades. Already, cracks are visible. The Wagner Group's short-lived mutiny in June 2023 exposed deep divisions between the military and private paramilitary forces. Russian elites, who have tolerated Putin's rule for decades in exchange for stability and wealth, might begin to reassess their loyalty. We could see political instability, protests, or even an elite-driven effort to replace Putin with someone seen as more pragmatic or less toxic to Russia as international standing. A loss could also accelerate brain drain and capital flight as more Russians flee an increasingly isolated and unstable country. Sanctions would likely remain in place until accountability is addressed, potentially including war crimes trials and reparations. Third, the impact on Ukraine. For Ukraine, a Russian loss would be nothing short of national vindication. It would mean reclaiming its sovereign borders and proving to the world that even a smaller country, when united and well-supported, can resist aggression. It would also pave the way for deeper integration with the West. Ukraine's path to joining NATO and the European Union would be clearer than ever before. Security guarantees, reconstruction aid, and long-term partnerships would transform the country's political and economic future, but it wouldn't be easy. Even after a Russian withdrawal, Ukraine would face the enormous task of rebuilding infrastructure, homes, schools, roads, and hospitals. Millions of Ukrainians remain displaced. Landmines litter vast swaths of territory. And scars, physical, emotional, and psychological, will take years to heal. Now, let's talk about the global repercussions. A Russian defeat in Ukraine would send a loud message to authoritarian regimes worldwide. Military aggression wouldn't be tolerated. Countries like China, watching closely with their own ambitions in Taiwan, would need to reassess their strategies. NATO, which has seen renewed unity and expansion since the war began, would emerge even stronger. Finland and Sweden already joined or applied to join, and the alliance has beefed up its eastern flank. A weakened Russia would lose leverage over Europe. Its use of energy as a geopolitical weapon, cutting gas supplies to pressure the EU, would no longer be as effective. The shift to alternative energy sources and suppliers has already begun, and it would likely accelerate. But not all consequences would be positive or predictable. There's the risk of escalation. If the Kremlin sees defeat as existential, not just militarily, but politically, it might resort to more extreme measures, including the use of tactical nuclear weapons. While analysts still see that as a last resort, it remains part of Russia's official military doctrine. The West would have to tread carefully to ensure any victory doesn't provoke a catastrophic overreaction. There's also the question of what happens to Russia's allies. Countries like Iran, North Korea, and China have quietly or overtly supported Russia, whether through drones, ammunition, or diplomatic cover. A loss could fracture those alliances, but it might also drive Russia closer to those regimes in a kind of anti-Western coalition of the isolated. And finally, the future of international law. A Russian defeat could mark a turning point in how the world responds to aggression. Institutions like the International Criminal Court, long seen as toothless, would be under pressure to deliver justice. War crimes trials for Russian commanders, and potentially for senior political figures, would become a rallying cry for human rights advocates. But achieving the justice would require unprecedented global cooperation and political will. So where do we go from here? The war is far from over. Russia still controls significant territory. Ukraine continues to fight, but at enormous human and economic cost. Western support remains strong, but questions about sustainability and public fatigue are growing. Elections in the US and Europe could change the political calculus. And inside Russia, the narrative remains tightly controlled, for now. But make no mistake, if Russia loses this war, the shockwaves will be felt everywhere, in Moscow, in Kyiv, in Brussels, in Washington, and beyond. So what do you think? What would be the most likely outcome if Russia were to lose the war against Ukraine? Do you believe the current path leads to a clear victory for either side, or are we looking at a long, grinding stalemate? And how should the international community prepare for the aftermath? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone, and your insights help fuel these conversations. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive valuable, please give the video a like, share it with someone interested in global affairs, and don't forget to subscribe for clear, fact-based updates on the stories that shape our world. Until next time, stay informed and stay curious.